So please join me in welcoming George Weigel.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for coming. I promised to get everyone home in time for the Orioles game, which does not begin until 10:05. That was a tough loss Sunday. I violated the second commandment at many points in the 8th, 9th, and 10th innings. But it's great of all of you to come, and I want to thank George for inviting me, Chris Gunty, my old friend here, the editor of the Catholic Review, which everyone in this room should be reading regularly, indeed religiously, if I may say, for coming here, and Chris is going to handle the book sales tonight. I think we all have the sense, after the past several months, that we're living in a period of real transition in the modern history of the Catholic Church. But I'm not sure that we're fully grasping the depth of the change that's underway, or what we're changing from to what we're changing to, not to mention what that means for all of us. And that is what I have tried to explain in the book, Evangelical Catholicism, which all of you will storm the stand over there and buy as soon as the Q&A is over. Those of you who aren't going home who are ordering it on Amazon as we sit here right now. What I've tried to do here is several things. I've tried to explain this distinctive moment in Catholic history. I've tried to describe the church that is being born at this moment and that all of you will carry into the future, long after I am off the scene, and watching your labors as I observe things on CNN Purgatory. I often say, being the loyal NBC guy that I am, of course CNN is Purgatory, so there's no need to have CNN Purgatory channel. That's just, you just get the main feed and you're set. And then to describe something of what I think needs to change in various facets of Catholic life in order to seize the enormous opportunity that's before us, as well as to meet the tremendous challenge that postmodern culture in the Western world presents to us. Let me begin this way, since we're all, I think, still a bit focused on papal transitions. It was already clear within a year or two after the election of Pope Benedict XVI that we knew something important about his successor. Whoever he was, wherever he came from, whatever he would have done, he would not have attended the Second Vatican Council. He would not have been physically present or part of the defining event of Catholic life in our time. Joseph Ratzinger, as all of you know, was a very influential theological advisor at Vatican II. His predecessor, Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, was a very influential bishop at Vatican II. But no pope after Benedict XVI, it was absolutely clear by as early as 2007, would have been at the council. So something was ended. And the question is, what was it? And what was that opening us up to? And I think the clue comes from the pontificate of John Paul II. You ask yourself, why did this then 80-year-old man, riddled with Parkinson's disease, insist on going to the Holy Land in March of 2000? Why did he insist on going on pilgrimage to the Holy places during the Great Jubilee of 2000. Wasn't because he hadn't been there before and wanted to see the sights. It wasn't to even focus the world's attention on the 2000th anniversary of the Incarnation. I think as we look back on that, we can now see that what this extraordinarily imaginative man was trying to do was carry the entire Catholic Church, and in some sense the entire Christian world, on that bent back of his to the holy places in this special millennial year. Why? So that people could experience again the reality of the Incarnation and could hear again the great commission that Christ gave the apostles at the end of his earthly ministry. Go forth and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The Pope wanted all of us to have a kind of Pentecostal experience again. That's why he did that. And that's why he concluded the Great Jubilee of 2000 with the apostolic letter Novo Millennio in Eunte, entering the new millennium, of January 6, 2001, when he challenged the whole church, all of us, to hear the command of Christ to the apostles on the Sea of Galilee, put out into the deep. Put out into the deep for what? Not for a bunch of fish, for a lot of people. Put out into the deep of a new evangelization, as he had begun to call it in 1992. Benedict XVI picked up this theme of the new evangelization, put it at the center of his papal ministry, and suggested that at the very center of that, at the very center of the new evangelization, was, as the signature phrase of his pontificate, friendship with Jesus Christ. Friendship with Jesus Christ. This is not the language that some friends of mine who are occupying the geriatric table in the back here tonight, you called it that. This is not the language we grew up with in the Baltimore of the late 1950s and 1960s. This is a much more Christocentric approach to being Catholic. We grew up with a church-centered approach to being Catholic, and that's very important because Christ and the church go together. But what the Catholic Church has come to understand, I suggest in this book, over a period of 125 years now, is that the center of the church and at the center of the church's mission is what our evangelical Protestant friends call a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That is what each of us is called to deepen in our lives of discipleship. That community of the friends of Christ forms a unique communion of disciples, all of whom must live in mission. Because, as John Paul II said in 1991, in the encyclical Redemptoris Missio, the mission of the Redeemer, the paradox of faith is that it increases the more you give it away. The more you share the faith with others, the more the faith grows in you. Now, what is being born in the Catholic Church today is a fresh mode of being Catholic that you can describe with the phrase new evangelization, which doesn't seem to have a lot of market traction these days, or what I have called and others have come to call Evangelical Catholicism. It's the same Lord, the same faith, the same baptism, but it's a different moment in history, and it's a different moment in cultural history. about every 500 years, you get this kind of a huge historical transition in the life of the church. The church of the New Testament, the church we're hearing about every day during the daily masses of Eastertide and the Acts of the Apostles, that New Testament church gave way over time to the Church of the Fathers, the patristic church, the Church of Augustine and Ambrose and John Chrysostom and Basil and Gregory Nazianzen and Maximus the Confessor. As New Testament Christianity met classical culture, it produced that mode of being Catholic we call the patristic youth. When the patristic church, after 500 years, began to rediscover elements of the forgotten classical heritage, particularly the thought of Aristotle, what was born was what we call medieval Christianity. Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Francis of Assisi, Clare of Assisi, an enormous new burst of Catholic energy that lasted for about 500 years, and then shattered in the early 16th century with the split of Western Christianity in the Reformation. So that medieval Christianity gave birth in its own time to what I call in the book Counter-Reformation Catholicism. That's the Catholicism in which everybody over 45 in this room grew up in. It was a Catholicism that stressed very basic catechism approach to the faith. Many of us remember the Baltimore Catechism from our youth, the distilling of the faith into these little nuggets. It stressed devotional piety, think miraculous medal, things like that. I got one too. We got several of them here, I'm sure. It was a Catholicism very much focused on the maintenance of large institutions. Churches, schools, hospitals, universities, colleges, etc. And for 500 years, it was a great thing. This was the form of Catholicism that came to the Western Hemisphere in the 16th century and brought the gospel to North and South America. It was the form of Catholicism that survived the onslaught of the French Revolution, the radical secularization of Europe in the 19th century. It was the form of Catholicism that survived and indeed defeated the greatest persecutor of Christianity in history, in communism. It was the form of Catholicism that gave us a whole new form of Marian piety through saints like Bernadette and Louise de Marillac and Therese of Lisieux. It was the Catholicism that began the serious evangelization of sub-Saharan Africa. But like everything else, its historical moment had to end. And I think what we're beginning to see now is that that is what all of the turmoil in the church over the last 50 years has been about. Because the Second Vatican Council was the hinge on which the church of the Counter-Reformation, the church in which most of your parents, most of you who are here, your parents grew up, the church in which I grew up, was giving way to this church of the new evangelization, or Evangelical Catholicism. And like every birth in human history, it's a messy business. It doesn't happen easily. And that's the turbulence through which we've been living. But I think that turbulence is beginning to settle down a bit. Because why? Because we've discovered that the only Catholicism that has a future is Catholicism in full. It's what my friend Cardinal Dolan calls dynamic orthodoxy. It's the opposite of what I've called in several books Catholic light. And the opposite of that, high-octane Catholicism, if you will, is the only Catholicism with a future because it's the only Catholicism that can meet the challenge of this cultural moment. And this brings us to the second big point. In this town, as recently as, 50 years ago, 55 years ago, the air we breathed helped transmit the faith. Some of you, I think, have read my little book, Letters to a Young Catholic. And I do that walk down memory lane, Baltimore, of years ago. It was in the air. It was in the air. And even when things began to get a little wiggy in the 60s, the culture at least was not violently opposed to the faith. It now is. It now is. We're living in a cultural moment in which people who assert biblical truth are labeled irrational bigots by their own government, by the United States Department of Justice. This is a very different scene from the one I grew up in. In that kind of a cultural environment, Catholic light does not have a chance. It can't make only a full embrace of what I call in the book, following the lead of John Paul II, the symphony of Catholic truth. All of these pieces of the puzzle that over a lifetime we learn how to put together into what is no longer a puzzle, but a really glorious mosaic. Only the embrace of all of that, and the affirmation that even if I don't know how to put all of the pieces together at this moment, I believe that the frame is there, and there is a way to put it together. That's the only future we've got. And interestingly enough, this is not a theoretical argument. If you look at the parts of the Catholic Church in the Western world today that are booming, not just surviving, but booming, they are the places that have taken both the embrace of dynamic orthodoxy and the Catholic symphony of truth and the evangelical imperative, the fact that all of us enter mission territory every day of our lives. Serious. You look at what I think is the gold standard among Catholic campus ministries in the United States today. Until our Dominican brothers get it done at Hopkins, I will come back in 5 years and see if you guys are the gold standard. The gold standard today is, of all places, Texas A&M University. Heart of the Bible Belt, College Station, Texas, has produced more religious vocations than Notre Dame over the past 20 years. Produces magnificent Catholic marriages and families. 5,000 people on a Sunday. They're running a $67 million capital campaign in the middle of a double-dip recession. Why? Because the gospel is being preached with compassion, but also without compromise. And because those 10,000 Catholic kids at 40,000 student Texas A&M are being challenged to be evangelists, to be missionaries. A place that's giving Texas A&M a run for its money, equally implausible, is the University of Nebraska. I was in Lincoln, Nebraska last October to speak to the Nebraska State Pro-Life Conference, and the campus minister there, a priest of the Lincoln Diocese, asked me if I would stop by the campus ministry for lunch with some students. Fine. Not much else to do in Lincoln, Nebraska on a Friday afternoon. I'm happy to help. So after observing there, first of all, there are 200 and some kids at Mass at noon on a Friday afternoon. And we go down in the basement of this church for lunch, and there are these two enormous sheet cakes on the table with candles all over. I said, "What's the party about?" And one of the students said to me, "Oh, we just started our 100th Bible study on campus, and we thought we ought to celebrate." What do you need me to talk to you for? I am completely useless in this, except to have a piece of cake with me. Princeton University, than which you can get no more secular. Maybe Smith, maybe Brown. Princeton has had for 20 years a booming Catholic campus ministry that is so active and so well integrated into the life of the university that the Blessed Sacrament is now reserved in Princeton Chapel. And there are public stations of the cross on Fridays during Lent around the Princeton campus. This is amazing stuff. The parishes that are booming in very difficult times, culturally, financially, and otherwise, are the parishes that preach the gospel without compromise and that challenge people to bring others into the communion of the faith. And so forth and so on around the Catholic world. The same is true with religious congregations and religious orders. Those who have embraced the new evangelization and the symphony of Catholic truth grow. Those who are still fighting the battles of the last 40 years are dying. And here's why they're dying. Here's why Catholic light is dying. Catholic light is dying because it's locked into the old paradigm. These are fights within the Counter-Reformation Church. Certain kinds of traditionalists want to ratchet down the rules even tighter, recreate a world that simply can't exist anymore. Then you've got the other side of that on the Catholic left. They want to loosen up everything, accommodate more to the culture on the theory that that's what will convert the culture, which it manifestly doesn't. But they're both stuck within this same institutional maintenance Counter-Reformation paradigm. And that's all over. Those arguments are all over. And I think one of the great examples of that in the future, and I'll conclude with this so we can get to some conversation. I think one of the great exemplars of that in the future will be the new Pope. I had the pleasure of spending an hour with then Cardinal Bergoglio in Buenos Aires last May. I was down doing some lectures in Catholic universities in Argentina. This is a real man of the Gospels, real man of God, a man who knows, I was saying to Chris Gunty earlier today, that a kept church, kept either by legal establishment, as the church often was in Latin America, or kept by cultural habit, has no future. A church that is not on offense in the sense of proposing the gospel, offering people the possibility of friendship with the Lord, is a church that is not going to make it. We don't bite, you can come in. This happened the last time. We had people completely freaked out next to the last time. Kept Catholicism is a failure of discipleship. That's the message of this Pope. So he's asking all of us to rediscover that missionary vocation into which we were baptized, for which we were confirmed, and for which we are nurtured in the Eucharist. Three sacraments of initiation bring us, should bring us, into a genuinely missionary vocation. I'll close on this note. About 15 years ago, I was down in the Dallas-Fort Worth area where everything is big. And I drove by this enormous Pentecostal church, mega church. Huge parking lot, probably could put several thousand cars in this parking lot. And I noticed that by each of the exits, there was a kind of, road sign up, and I thought it probably said, right turn only, left turn only. If it was Texas, it had to be right turn only, I'm sure. And I went over and looked at one of these things. It didn't say that at all. It said, you are entering mission territory. Everybody who left that church every Sunday got another little note. You are entering mission territory. We all enter mission territory every day. Families, schools, businesses, jobs, culture, society, politics. It's all mission territory. And lay Catholics are the primary evangelizers of all of those parts of our society. That's the message of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. I'm sure it'll be the message of Pope Francis. And I invite all of you to join the party because there is nothing more exciting, nothing more ennobling, nothing more satisfying than bringing others into the friendship with the Lord that we've all been privileged to experience in our own lives. So, that's the Church of the Future that I try to describe in this book. The second half of the book is the George Weigel program for fixing everything that's wrong so that we can get on with the new evangelization. That's less important than the front part of the book in which I try to describe this historical shift, what this asks of all of us, and so forth and so on. So, thank you very much.
All questions will be taken here at the podium. And now we have volume, so everyone can hear. So if you'd like to come right up here, go for it. Can I start with the question?
Sure.
Did you,
Catholic
control the
mic. That's hardly necessary.
Yeah. Did you mean to put traditionalists under the Catholic light?
No, I say that there are certain forms of Catholic tradition that are still locked in the paradigm of the Counter-Reformation Church, because that's the only form of Catholicism they can imagine. And that's a mistake. That's a mistake, because that form is passing from the historical scene. And I think, we've seen this now in the last two pontificates. I mean, it was ludicrous to try to describe John Paul II or Benedict XVI, and it will be equally ludicrous to try to describe Pope Francis in terms of this conventional left-right business. At what yard line do you find it? Well, you find all of these guys in a completely different game. It's a different gridiron. It's not a question of finding some mythical 50-yard line between the National Catholic Reporter and the Wanderer. That's all old paradigm stuff. That is not new evangelization.
Thank you, Mr. Weigel, for kind of being here with us tonight. So you talked a lot about a lot of secular institutions and universities embracing the new evangelization and doing two examples were these two big secular universities really finding that balance of orthodoxy and the new evangelization. My question for you is how is our traditional, our Catholic universities, our Catholic institutions in the U.S., what is your take on that, and how can they really step up? Because it seems like the secular institutions are doing a lot better job kind of embracing that balance.
Yeah, it's perhaps less a balance than a complementarity between dynamic orthodoxy, genuinely understood, impels you to mission. you can't keep it to yourself. So you want to invite others into it. And let me just pause on that for a minute before I get to the Catholic Universities thing. When Chris Gunty and I were talking earlier today, I said to him, I think in this cultural moment, we will begin to evangelize more by example than by argument, which is a very difficult thing for people like me who are in the argument business to wrap their heads around. But it's true. Why did Christianity move from this totally marginal sect of off-brand Jews and Gentiles in the Eastern Mediterranean outback to form what now some historians reckon was perhaps 50% of the Roman Empire by the time of the Constantinian settlement in 313. How did that happen? Think of the movie Gladiator. Gladiator is set after the death of Marcus Aurelius, so we're in the middle of the 2nd century AD. It's still a remarkably brutal society. Remarkably brutal society. And in that world, the example of Christians, in which there was neither slave nor free, there was real fraternity, in which women were not property, in which unwanted children were not exposed, their form of Roe versus Wade, in which the sick were cared for and not marginalized, in which there was this fantastic witness of the martyrs. In that kind of a world, that looks like a very humane way to live. And suddenly people are saying to these Christians, how can you live that way? Then that becomes the opening to evangelization and eventually catechesis. Let me tell you about the Lord Jesus Christ, and off we go from there. I think in our circumstance today, that's probably the grand strategy that makes the most sense. We will model in an increasingly cold, individualistic culture of non-commitment, culture of the worship of me, myself, and I. We will model a more humane way of life. And then people are going to eventually say to us, how can you live that way? That looks good, but how can you do that? That's what Catholic higher learning should equip young people to be and do. And some places do that. Some are hopelessly lost and are not worth trying to save except to take the brand away from them, because this is confusing. Others are worth fighting over. And the fight goes on, and I think in some cases will eventually be won simply because of changes in faculty and whatnot over time. The actuarial tables even things out over time. And then some have been good all the way along. So it's a mixed picture, but from a purely marketing point of view, in an American world of higher education where everything is niche marketing today, everything is niche marketing, the niche, we are authentically Catholic, is going to attract people. It's going to attract people. And I think some people are beginning to figure that out. So I was slightly disconcerted this afternoon about one of these places, which will remain nameless. I'm giving the commencement address there Saturday. And they sent me an email with my schedule for Friday and Saturday. And it said 11 o'clock Saturday, Bachelorette Mass. Not baccalaureate Mass, but Bachelorette Mass. Ding, 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 few words about spelling in the course of my remarks on Saturday. So, those are my thoughts on it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. Am I speaking loud
I
enough?
think you're on.
Okay. I guess it might be from my experience not yet being a parent, but a lot of talk that I've heard about evangelization focuses on connecting with other young adults or older adults, basically connecting with other adults. But I know some of us in this room are parents or hoping to be parents in the next 5-10 years. And I know some of us in this room are teachers or catechists. I'm a catechist. My question is, with this shift in approaching how we present the gospel, how we spread the faith, how will it affect our approach to the younger generation? Because I can speak from my experience. I can see my parents' generation and how my teachers taught the faith. It was a little bit mix of trying to implement Vatican II, but also a mixture of still being all about the iron fist and following the rules. But if we're starting to shift away from that approach with other adults, how will we? How does this change how we teach our younger generations, especially if a lot of them are interacting with adults who themselves also are in the process of being evangelized?
I think the beginning of wisdom on that is to understand just how difficult it's going to be. Because your kids are going to get completely contrary signals every time they turn on the television, every time they go online, every time they walk through a mall, every time they walk through the streets. They're going to get counter-biblical, if you will, signals. So, how do we, without retreating into catacombs and bunkers, maybe at some point, but it's been known to happen before, but we're not ready to declare that yet. How do we do that? I think one way we do it is we begin to immerse young people in the thought world and the language world, to use a word I absolutely hate because it's at the center of the whole postmodern cultural nonsense. But I'll use it. We have to immerse people in the biblical narrative, in the biblical story of how the world works. And that means children's Bibles, reading regularly with them, not saying, oh, that's a myth, this is a cute story, there weren't angels singing at Christmas or whatever. No, you immerse people in the thought world and the imagination of the Bible, and they learn to look at the world differently. They learn to see that the world is not just one damn thing after another, that salvation history is the real history of the world, the deepest history of the world. And that can begin very, very young, it seems to me. In the book, I talk about the church of the future having to be a culture-forming counterculture. And the countercultural part of that means living inside, if you will, the biblical view of history, the biblical understanding of the dignity of the human person, and so forth and so on. And then out of that, trying to convert the ambient public culture, which is living by a very, very different set of standards. So that's one idea. The recovery with young children and certainly throughout late childhood and adolescence, of regular reception of the sacraments, including the sacrament of reconciliation, seems to be absolutely essential. Unless you're living in a different rhythm than the rest of your peers, you will get sucked into that great culture of me, myself, and I very, very easily. That's why stable, vital parishes with really good liturgy and regular availability of the sacrament of reconciliation are absolutely crucial to all of this. There's going to be a lot more, I think, good audiovisual material around now and in the future than there was 10, 15, 20 years ago. I may have, last time I was here, talked about Father Bob Barron, my NBC sidekicks, Catholicism series, which I'm sure many of you have seen. It would be a great gain for the new evangelization if every parish in America scrapped its present RCIA program and bought the Barron DVDs and just showed those. I mean, I have lots of friends who are going around sort of wearing metaphorical t-shirts saying, I survived RCIA and I'm still a Catholic. Get rid of them all, show the films, there's a great study guide that goes with them, and let's do that for 3 or 4 years, and then we can reconceive RCIA from there. I think there's probably a lot of good stuff for kids on that. There's an enormously good Catholic literature, fiction, that was produced in the 20th century, particularly in English. This is being largely forgotten. It just boggles my mind that kids go through Catholic high schools and colleges today without knowing who Flannery O'Connor was, or Walker Percy, or Evelyn Waugh, or Graham Greene. And there was an unbelievable efflorescence of fiction from a distinctively Catholic perspective, largely in English, in the 20th century. Kids need to be exposed to them. And immersed in them. So, those are some things that come to mind on that. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks.
Again, I want to thank you as well for coming and joining us. Being in the...
Let me interrupt for just a second. Father has just returned from service as a chaplain in the army in Afghanistan, so let's give him a round of
I'd like to also give a shout out for 2 of my friends here who were overseas with me here, and they also wonderful to serve, Lisa and Joanne. So give them
Thank you.
The transition from parish life to military life. In the parish life, we're dealing with the 20% who actually go to church, but in the military life, I'm dealing with the 80% who don't go to church. And first of all, the Catholicism DVDs I never heard of until I got there, and they're all over the place downrange in the sandbox, as we say. A lot of the Catholics that I've met, I've come to hate this phrase. I was raised Catholic, but I was baptized Catholic, but, and so I see this whole emergence of what I call the but Catholics. And, that actually came out in a homily once by accident. I'm like, oh no.
Worse things have come out
yes,
in homilies, I assure you.
I found a lot of them leave because they find the liturgy boring. They're not being fed in homilies. They don't know our faith, and they're just disconnected, and they're not being connected. But I found on the other side, a lot of them are coming home because of the liturgy, because of them meeting people that Christ has put on their path, and how important for us, necessary for us, to be faithful to that moment when somebody comes in our lives as lay, religious, priest, or whatever, to be faithful to the moment and faithful to the gospel. And I found that has hit so many people. But living in a secular world, the need to address the secular world using natural law language, because they don't want to hear the Bible, they don't want to hear anything else, but to evangelize using our gift of natural law. And when it comes to contraception, abortion, you know, for me, I feel like, okay, I can do that. I can address the natural law to the pagans that I'm dealing with. But the issue of homosexuality, I'm still trying to find a real good argument from natural law. Of course, you know, they're imposing upon the military another social experiment, and a lot of chaplains are scared because of that, because now we're going to have to do family life stuff for homosexual couples, which you can't do. Sorry, you know, sorry, you can't do it. And that's down the road. People have no idea that, you know, chaplains are really afraid that we're going to lose the chaplaincy over this. I was listening to the Theology of the Body, I think the 8 CD collection that's out there, floating out there, and this question keeps coming up to a lot of the presenters there as well, issue of homosexuality, but they're always dealing with it from a biblical base, and which obviously I'm all for it, but how do we address that issue to a secular world using natural law language? That's my struggle.
Yeah, that's a very searching question, Father, and it's one that I'm frankly struggling with myself right now. I mean, for 30 years, with my dear friend, the late Father Richard John Newhouse, and with others, I have been part of a community of intellectuals who described our work as, in Richard's phrase, developing a religiously informed public philosophy for the American experiment in ordered liberty. And if you decode that, it meant a biblically informed natural law approach to public policy argument in the United States, etc. And while I think we have made some considerable headway on that, on the life issues, which are rather easier to grasp in these terms, plus the fact of sonograms, which have made an enormous difference, plus the fact that every young person of any self-awareness born in this country since January 1973 knows that they didn't have to be, that another choice could have been made and they would not be. And that gets you thinking. But I really do wonder now, and I frankly don't have an answer to your question. I really wonder whether in the denatured society in which we live, an appeal to the natural law can work when there is no nature. Now, I mean, I've been using the phrase, the deep truths built into the human condition, as a way to try to get away from the phrase, you know, there is a human nature. And I think some people can still recognize that there are deep moral truths built in that any morally sane person recognizes. But they're rather minimal in number. Here's the example that may make of how difficult this situation is. In Spain, in 2007, a very secularist, socialist government passed a law changing the way gender specifications on your national identity card could be done. Spain, like most European countries, there's a national identity card. Official government document that says you are a citizen of Spain. And it has a gender identifier on it. As of 2007, Juan can walk into any civil registry office in Spain, sign an affidavit saying, I am Juanita, and without any intervention by surgeons or anybody else, come out with a new identity card that says, this is Juanita. This is the triumph of pure willfulness over given reality. I mentioned this once in a lecture, perhaps more flippantly than I should. I said it's a good thing Alan J. Lerner isn't writing lyrics to My Fair Lady these days, because he'd have to say the dame in Spain is mainly in the name. That's the reality. For those of you who took philosophy degrees, this is pure nominalism. It's pure, it's the triumph of will over reality. Now, that is not far from where things are here. And in that kind of a cultural environment, I'm beginning to think that we need to ponder very carefully St. Paul's experience on the Areopagus. I mean, he goes to the Areopagus, he tries to kind of, I perceive that you are religious people, the unknown God. Let me try to get at you guys through an appeal to your philosophical system. And of course it doesn't work. And he eventually goes on to Corinth and then writes the great 1 Corinthians. I preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and an absurdity to Gentiles. We may be at a cultural point where that is the option available. I'm not prepared to say that completely yet. I think there are some things that an appeal to those deep moral truths built into the human condition and into us can still do the trick on. But I think we're learning in the marriage debate they don't. Some of you have seen the book by my friends Robbie George, Sharif Gerges, and Ryan Anderson, Marriage, Man and Woman in Defense. It's a pure new natural law argument. It is completely persuasive within its own premises. You can't beat these guys. You know, once you're arguing within that framework. But I don't know that it's convinced a whole lot of people to change their minds if they were on the other side of this. Why? Because they don't share the premise that there's something called human nature, or that we can reach an understanding of absolute moral goods by a purely rational process. So I think what you're describing, Father, is exactly the degree of the mess that we're in. And I wish I could give you an answer to that. I mean, I'm trying to think about this. Others of my colleagues are. In the June-July issue of the journal First Things, which I think some of you see, others should see. The editor, Rusty Reno, has a very interesting front of the book column on what is natural law still good for. And if you give me an email address, I'll make sure that you get that before the evening is over. But I think I was out in Kennewick, Washington, south of Spokane, east of Yakima. This is otherwise known as the middle of nowhere. One day a week, 300 people for a book event, parishes from all over the diocese of Yakima and Spokane. And after I did something a little less, a little more formal than what I did here tonight. And then it was a Q&A. And a guy gets up in the back, looks like a rancher, and absolutely blew me away. Said, for 30 years, you and your colleagues, and then he did the mantra, have been trying to devise a religiously informed moral philosophy for the public philosophy for the American experiment order of liberty. Do you think you still have a chance? And I said, sir, that is a very searching question to which I am giving considerable thought. I'll leave you my email address. And, meanwhile, I hope you're growing some good grapes here and making some nice wine. Because I think that's our situation. We've lost a sense of the givenness of things. And that makes it very, very difficult. I completely sympathize sympathize with your situation. And it may be, as I said a moment ago, that the real answer to this over time is example. I mean, it's just the attraction of example, and then you can draw people into that biblical worldview at that point, which can, I still believe, can be buttressed by the arts of reason. But the arts of reason are not getting us very far. And they're not getting us as far as they used to. That's for sure. One more, maybe? Yeah. A couple more? How are we doing on time? Pardon? You have a lot of time, but I got to get to Thursday tonight, and we got to sell some books and sign them. A couple more. Yeah. Does this young lady want to ask a question here?
Well, I was just saying.
And then you can do one. Yeah.
I was actually just saying that I think you pretty much answered it, but I was thinking about all your comments about the culture. I totally agree that the culture now that we're facing is pretty much antithetical to a lot of the truths that we hold. So what does evangelization look like in that culture? You have Alistair McIntyre saying that discourse is just emoting at this point. We can't even have a rational discussion because we're arguing from premises that are totally incommensurable, and you already spoke to that. So my question is, how do I reach my friends, my peers, people who are out there? How do I evangelize on a daily basis if I really can't hearken to this kind of understanding mutual framework that we have? I don't know what that looks like. I totally agree with you that it has to be a daily thing, but is it only example? I mean, not only, but is it purely example? Is it, like you say, do you get to throw reason in there? That's what I can't reconcile at this point.
No, that's all part of the issue here. I think it depends on the person you're dealing with, obviously. With some people, a good novel can do this. Let them, what would you give somebody? Willa Cather's Death Comes for the Archbishop. Beautiful book, really written inside a richly biblical Christian perspective about a genuinely heroic man. It doesn't, it's not wearing it on your sleeve. It's a great piece of American literature. If they like rich magenta prose, Brideshead Revisited is usually worth a read. So that's one thing. Literature is one route in. Some film might be another route in. 3 weeks ago, I was in the Twin Cities on a Sunday afternoon, and I thought, great, I'll get out to see what this Target field looks like, the Twins ballpark. Well, it was 34 degrees and snowing. So I decided that instead of going to Target Field, I would go see 42, the movie about Jackie Robinson. And I wrote my Catholic Press column about that last week or 2 weeks ago, can't remember. And I said I was very struck by the fact that everybody burst into applause at the end of the film. Rarely happens in movies. And what were they applauding? I don't think they were applauding a great performance by Harrison Ford as Branch Rickey. I think they were applauding the idea of heroism and courage and decency in the face of serious crappiness. So that moral instinct has not completely died in us. My friend Janet Smith, the moral philosopher, whom some of you I'm sure have read her stuff, Janet has said for 20 years, it's not true that Americans don't believe in moral absolutes. If you think that's the case, light up a cigar in the no smoking section of a restaurant. You will quickly find out how quickly people, how firmly people believe in moral absolutes. The problem is we don't know how to account for the moral absolutes we believe in.
And there's so many inconsistencies, it's very irrationally based.
So, those are some thoughts on that. Yes, gentleman here, Father Michael is edging his way.
Quick question. What do you see as the ecumenical dimension to this evangelical Catholicism, as well as the charismatic dimension? The Holy Father spoke about a new Pentecost for new evangelization, as well as the fractured body of Christ cries out, well, you guys can't even get along, why would I believe in Christ?
I think the ecumenism is clear in something like the pro-life movement, for example, or the pro-marriage, rightly understood movement, which is essentially a coalition of Catholics who thought evangelicals were crazy 40 years ago, and evangelicals who thought Catholics were the whore of Babylon 40 years ago. Well, in the trenches of the American culture war, we've discovered some truths about each other. And I think they have taught us something about the centrality of a personal relationship with the Lord, the imperative of mission. I hope we are beginning to teach them something about sacraments, about the communion of saints. I think it's a very interesting sign that my friend Dr. Timothy George, Dean of a major Baptist seminary in Alabama, is writing a book on the Blessed Virgin Mary for evangelicals. I mean, that would have been inconceivable 25 years ago. Inconceivable. There's lots of co-belligerency going on here. The theological discussion is going to go on for the next 200 years. And when you have this very low church, unsacramental part of the Christian world, it's going to take a while to move things along. But that does not mean we cannot work together on cultural change. And I think there are some ways in which we can probably evangelize together. This gets difficult because of, some of them get a little grabby. And this is a problem in some military environments, I know, particularly Air Force academies have big problems with this. But since that's the only Protestantism that has a future, and Evangelical Catholicism is the only Catholicism that's got a future, Church of the New Evangelization, then we better figure out a way to make this work. So, there's some thoughts on that. Yes?
Just curious, we heard a lot about the group that Pope Francis has just recently constituted to deal with reforming the Roman Curia. And at first it was big news and people were speculating about it, saying it was much needed. And it seems like recently there hasn't been as much news about it. So I was wondering, since you're an insider, if you have any insight as to what maybe that particular commission or committee will mean for the future of Evangelical Catholicism.
The reason why the Roman Curia has to be reformed, and there is an entire chapter of the book on that, and since the Pope has the book, I signed it for him 2 days after his election, we may hope that some things are going to happen. The reason why that has to happen is so that the central administrative machinery of the Catholic Church becomes an instrument of the new evangelization, rather than reconstituting itself as a kind of papal court. There's no room for that sort of thing in the Church of the future. And I think the present Pope's criticism of clerical ambition and careerism have been spot on and very much bear on this question of curial reform, because what really needs, in addition to structures, which I described, how I would redo the structure, you need a change in culture. And there's some structural, the two are not completely separate, there's some structural things you can do to accelerate the change of culture. But that is going to happen. That is going to happen. It's not going to happen in the next 3 weeks, but it's certainly going to happen in the next 3 years. Some of it may even begin in the next 3 months. Stay tuned.
Pardon me?
Hi, I have what I think is essentially a historical question. As you described the 500-year cycles, at least the last two, the Counter-Reformation and the cycle in which we're currently beginning, were described in language that I would say connoted that the church was in these epochs being reactionary to, if you will, innovations on the part of those that are mounting the assaults on the church. Now, I prefer to think as the Lord as the forward-seeing innovator. So what am I missing historically, or...
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. Thank you for letting me clarify that. We call it the Counter-Reformation. In fact, it could have been called the Catholic Reformation. The Council of Trent recognized that the Catholic Church was a mess. It also recognized that the Catholic Church bore the full truth of the gospel. So the whole point of Trent was, over 22 years, to straighten out what needed straightening out in the Catholic Church, particularly in terms of training of the clergy, residency of bishops, get a catechism that sums everything up, so forth and so on. So Counter-Reformation, even though it says Counter-Reformation, is very much a forward thrust purification of the church for mission. As I mentioned, I mean, this was the Catholicism that evangelized the Western Hemisphere and began to evangelize sub-Saharan Africa in the 19th century. Today, if I suggested that the Church of the New Evangelization was simply a reaction to a cultural mess, that was not the message I intended to convey. I spent 2 chapters of this book explaining how the church that's being born now began with Leo XIII in 1878, and it was essentially a Catholicism of a new engagement, critical engagement, with modern culture, with the idea of transforming modern culture. So that what is being born today begins in the late 19th century, passes through a lot of important Catholic reform movements in the mid-20th century, including the liturgical movement, Catholic social action, etc., reaches a high point of drama at Vatican II, which is then authoritatively interpreted by John Paul II and Benedict XVI through the prism of the new evangelization. So this whole process comes out the far end of the Church of the New Pentecost. The Church of the New Pentecost. Now, it just happens that this is going on in the nick of time because the tidal wave of cultural degradation is sweeping over us. But this is fundamentally all Catholic reform over 2 millennia is fundamentally a question of the bride of Christ trying to be a more authentic partner to the divine spouse. So it's all from inside. But that doesn't mean that there are pressures from outside that are, pushing things along.
Thank you.
Does that work? Okay.
Yes.
Father Michael Descanis, who will be happy to sign up a half a dozen young men for the seminary.
We're looking for some good men. I'm the vocations director of the diocese. We're looking for fighters. But it's an exciting time in the church. We've got an American Pope, pretty exciting, and we have a former Pope who's still living, and you are you're a good commentator on the church. You're over in Rome. You're part of the discussion. So could you just share with us a couple stories? Some interesting things that were going on among the cardinals, or about Pope Francis, or his relationship to Benedict. Just a couple stories.
This was very different this time. This is the second one of these deals I've done. It felt different, and not just because I was 8 years older, and because it was Lent, which meant no bourbon. Wine, yes. Bourbon, no. In fact, the Cardinal Archbishop of New York called me at 6:30 a.m. on February 12th, the morning after Benedict had dropped this little bombshell. And doesn't say hello, doesn't say good morning, doesn't say sorry, I'm calling at this ridiculous hour, since he knew I was going to be up anyway. He begins the conversation and said, well, guess we're not giving up drinking this Lent, are we? I said, see you in Rome, brother. This was different in that there was no funeral preceding the conclave. And I think in the abstract, you can say, well, what difference does it make? Well, it makes a huge difference. Because there had been no period of mourning. There had been no reckoning with the four last things, if you will. There had been no liturgical catharsis. There was just, he was here and then he wasn't here. And that had an effect that I have to say was not altogether edifying. People were really on their best behavior in 2005, in part because the whole church had shared in that astonishing witness of John Paul II at the end of his life. And then, the world coming to the funeral. There was none of that this time. And so some of the less fortunate human elements of the church came to the fore. And there was a fair amount of elbow throwing and whatnot, largely through the media. So that was different. And it was strikingly different that way. Now, I think when things finally calmed down and the doors were locked, and you're sitting there under Michelangelo's Last Judgment, then the deeper dimensions of this begin to really come to the fore. And I think the result of what had been a very difficult month was a great result, for which we can thank the Holy Spirit, the prayers of people all over the world, which you can feel. I mean, there's a sense of the world church supporting this. This was also a very different conclave in terms of its focal point. The focal point of 2005 was continuity. We've just had this 26.5-year astonishing run. What's the best way to try to keep that going? And then, once it became clear that that was the issue, then Cardinal Ratzinger seemed to be the guy for that. This time around, the issue was governance. That there really had to be reform in the engine room, as Ronald Knox called the Vatican. The engine room needed some cleaning up, and therefore you want an experienced reformer to do that. And once that decision began to coalesce, or that idea began to coalesce, and the job description was tried on various possibilities, I think then it became clear by, I would say, the Sunday night before the conclave was closed on Tuesday afternoon, that if cleaning up the engine room is job one, then you might want an older man who doesn't have to think long game, who can just do this and then in the natural course of events depart the scene. And once it became okay in people's minds not to jump a generation, didn't have to find the ideal 65-year-old or 67-year-old. Then Cardinal Bergoglio, I think, became the obvious and perhaps only serious possibility. Once the fact that he was 76 was no longer a problem, then snowballed very